right. Even if you haven't done it, haven't finished it, this is available for you at all times. So if you need to do it after class too, that's quite okay. So plan for today is we have a little bit of a lecture day today. It shouldn't be too terribly long. But if I feel like it's starting to run a little late, we'll take a break halfway in between. And then we're going to decide on the final pop culture piece that you will choose as a group. I did look over all the brainstormed list. There is a considerable amount of overlap, as I expected. So make sure you have plenty of alternatives. If you don't get to choose the one that is in your top three, for example, passengers, stowaways, I saw those quite a bit on the list. So keep that in mind. But we will do that at the end of class today. Any questions before I move forward? All right, I have the lab report set as due tomorrow. I believe it is going to be submitted online. I don't think it's due till like midnight tomorrow. So again, you still have some chances to ask me questions tomorrow if you run into any problems. All right, we're going to talk about soil nutrients today. All right, so soil nutrients, they're important. All right, so soil nutrients, often if people test soil fertility, they're testing the amount of nutrients in the soil. And basically how many nutrients are there, the percentages of each nutrient can tell us how well the soil is going to be able to sustain. What nutrients are found in soils? Well, there's quite a bit of nutrients. Three major ones that plants rely on are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And these are often the ones you'll see in fertilizers that you might buy at the store because they're often the ones that can be the most depleted by growing vegetation. There are many other nutrients in the soil, right? I put on here that there's many minor nutrients because plants don't need them in as large of quantities as, say, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Right? So these might be things like iron and zinc and copper, manganese, right? All those minor elements in the soil that are needed, but just not in those high quantities, right? And then there can also be other things in the soils that are toxic, like lead, like the video had pointed out, but also salts, right? If soils are too salty, right, only certain plants will be able to grow in those salty soils. Most plants do not tolerate a lot of salts in their soils, right? So major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, right? How do the plants access the soil nutrients? Right? Well, we know roots grow through the soil, right? So we're going to take up our nutrients through the roots, right? And we know that soil is a mixture of soil particles, but also pores, right? Now, in those pores, we can find that soil solution, so the water and dissolved nutrients in that water, right? We can also have air pockets, right, which also provide some important aeration, right? So we have our soil particles, we have the mixture of soil and nutrients and air surrounding those soil particles. How do the roots actually access those soil nutrients? All right, well, here's where we get some terminology here, and I've tried to cut it down to the most basic of terminology here. We think about nutrients, right? Or we can think about an atom of a singular nutrient here. And if we have an atom, we have our atomic structure. In the middle, we have our nucleus with our protons and our neutrons. But surrounding our nucleus, we have our electrons, right? Now, an ion is going to be an atom or a molecule, right? So this is a singular atom. A molecule would be many atoms put together, right, that have a charge, right? And when they have a charge, it means they have either lost or gained an electron, leaving it with either a positive or a negative charge, right? If it's an ion with a positive charge, we would call it a cation, right? So a cation has lost an electron or more than one electron, right? But at least one. And by losing some of its negative charge, it leaves the rest of the atom positive, right? So a cation would be a positively charged atom or molecule, right? It's a type of ion. On the other hand, excuse me, I still had one more slide here. So common cations in the soils that we might find would be like nitrates here. Oh, I animated the wrong ones. These are actually our next ones here. right? So these are negatively charged, so they are not a cation, and we will come back to those. If they are negatively charged, it would be an anion, right? So an anion in this case, instead of losing an electron, it has gained one or more electrons, right? So it's gaining more of those negatively charged electrons, which means the atom or the molecule itself tends to be negatively charged, right? Common anions would be these nitrates and these phosphates in orange here. And we can see they have those little negative symbols to them, right? Common cations in green here would be things like potassium, magnesium, calcium, right? They all have those positive charges associated with them. All right, now when we're thinking about ions, we have to remember opposites attract, all right? So we're going to be looking at cations, we're going to be looking at anions, and how they are attracted to their opposite charges. So when we think about soil particles and what charges soil particles have, right? Clay and soil organic matter tend to have a negative charge, right? Now that's not always the case, but the majority of the time we are going to have negative charges associated with the organic matter and the clay content, right? Now generally most soils worldwide will have a net negative charge, so most soils worldwide tend to have a percentage of clay in them. Right, we can see gravel, sand, and silt, they all have these positively charged particles, whereas clay is negatively charged. All right, time to put this all together. So how do plants access the soil nutrients? All right, we know that clay particles and organic matter are negatively charged. And we can see here I have these negatively charged soil particles. Right? We know that cations, which are positively charged, right, will be attracted to a negative charge. So they're actually attracted to these soil particles here. You can see that our positively charged ions are kind of associated with those soil particles in that image here. Anions are not, right? Anions are negatively charged, so they're not going to be attracted to the soil particles. Instead, they're just going to kind of hang out in that soil solution surrounding our soil particles, right? And so when we think about the charges of our soils and the charges of our nutrients, it influences which ions are free in the soil solution. And typically if they're free in the soil solution, like these anions here, right, they're a little easier for plants to uptake. And which ones are held onto by the soil particles. All right, we're going to start by talking about anions. So anions, they are negatively charged. They are floating free in the soil solution here. They are really easy for roots to uptake into their system, right? Because they're just hanging out, right? Plants can easily take them into their system. But the problem with this is because they are not held onto by a soil particle, they can be easily washed away by rainfall or leached out of the soil. So if we have a rainstorm, those nutrients are going to be washed away, right? So while they're easy for the plant to take up, they're also easy for the soil to lose, right? So pros and cons there. All right, cations, on the other hand, like I said, they're sorbed, or another word of saying that is held by the soil particles, right? So they're held onto by our soil particles, right? And so in order for for plants to utilize those cations, they have to first be released from those soil particles, right? And this is going to be through a process called cation exchange, right? And I'm going to detail this out in the next couple of slides here, right? But I just threw a lot of terminology at you, so before we go on to the process of cation exchange, let's just take a step back. I have listed out 3 soils here, right? I want you to rank those soils in terms of the amount of negatively charged soil particles that can be found, and determine which soil may hold the higher amount or the highest amount of nutrients. And I've given you this graph to help you determine the percentage of clay in each of those soil types. Feel free to talk with one another here. I know it's a Monday. I'm going to give you a little extra time here because I still hear discussion going on.
Oh.
That's okay. I kind of designed this to be more, put a lot of concepts together. Do what? To read it. So if we're looking at how negative the soils are, what soil particles are negative clay. So we're really only focused on one side of this chart, right? The percentage of clay. So if I look at, say, the silt, which is all the way over here, or I have silt.
Still clay.
Right? I was just kind of following across to this clay side to see what the percentage of clay is. I'm not so concerned with
Where's the
what
one?
the percentage is.
Oh, yeah.
All right, let's discuss this question together. So I've asked you to rank the soils here according to how negatively charged the soils might be. Right? If I'm determining negative charges in the soil, what soil particle am I focusing on? Clay. Yeah, clay is negatively charged. The others are positively charged. So I'm focusing on clay. And so how would I rank my 3 soils going across? Let's start with the silt loam. How would that rank comparative to the rest of them? High, medium, or low? I have it as medium here. And maybe I did this. Nope. Let me stand. So this one could have up to about 30% of clay, right? And it's a little bit tricky. I can see why you put it as low, because it also can have like 0% of clay, right? If I'm comparing it to the others, I'd have to know percentage of silt and percentage of sand to kind of make that determination of where in that silty loam I might be taking the soil sample from. So I place it as medium just because it kind of gets up into this like 20 to 30%. What about the sandy clay? What did we rank it as? Yeah, most negative. So sandy clay is all the way up here. It has like 40 to 50% compared to those other two. It would be the most negative, which leaves this loamy sand. I ranked it as least, right? Because even though I can have that 0 percentage, just like that silty loam, it can only get up to about 15% of clay, right? Does that make sense for everyone here? All right. So which one might have the highest amount of nutrients that it can hold on to? The silt loam, the sandy clay, or the loamy sand?
Sandy clay.
Sandy clay, yes, and it's the most negative, most negatively charged particles. They're going to hold on to those nutrients, right? Even if there's a rainfall, right, which takes away all those anions, those cations will still be held on to. All right. So this one was kind of one to make you think a little bit, right? Read and interpret some graphs, kind of put multiple concepts into play here. All right, so I'm going to back up one slide here. Oh, lots of transitions. All right, so I mentioned these cations, right? They are held onto by our soil particles, right? So in order for plants to access the cations, we have to release them from the soil particles, right? And that is this process called cation exchange, right? So now if I go forward again, right? Cation exchange is this process by which plants will produce hydrogen atoms, right? Symbolically on the graphs as H+, right? That would be the symbol for the hydrogen ions. That will replace the cations that are on the soil particles, right? And so we're going to release these hydrogen cations into the soil, and it's essentially going to bump away or bump off the cations that are held onto by this negatively charged soil particles, right? So we're kind of replacing the nutrients that is on the soil particle with the hydrogen ion that the soil produced. And when that gets bumped off the soil particle, right, it's now free floating in the solution, the plant can take it up, right? But there's also a slight downside to this, right? So if it happens to be raining at the time, right, any ions that are bumped off of those soil particles and are now free floating in the solution can also be washed away, just like those anions. All right, let's walk through this. So we have our plant up here. Our plant is producing these hydrogen ions, right? Those hydrogen ions will be released into the soil solution, and it's going to replace a cation on a soil particle, right? So it's going to kick it off, and that, so now we have our hydrogen held onto by that soil particle, right, where this potassium ion was. This potassium ion is now free floating, right? It's now free in that soil solution, so that plant can now take up that nutrient, right? So we're kind of replacing it with those hydrogen ions, right? And so when we look at this process as a whole, we could make a measurement of this process. We would measure the cation exchange capacity. This is often a common measurement in soils to see how well or how easily the soils can give up their soil nutrients, right? And if we have a higher cation exchange capacity, it just means that there's a higher nutrient reserve in the soil, right? Now I know this is a process, right? And so I have linked on here a video to recap, and I will go to it on the next slide here. Just want to give you all a chance to write down your notes. Right, so cation exchange capacity is the measurement. Cation exchange is the process by which plants do this. Right, higher cation exchange capacity means that soil has a larger nutrient reserve. All right, visuals for processes, in my opinion, are immensely helpful. I'm a visual learner. Slideshow. All right, well, that begs the question, all right, do plants need soil? Well, after everything we've learned about, maybe you're thinking, yeah, plants need soil. Soil has the nutrients, right? Well, there's other ways to grow plants, right? We can grow them hydroponically, which means growing them in water, right? They don't have soil at all. So, do plants need soil? Right? And this is kind of a discussion question I want to prompt you all, and maybe I'm going to give you about a minute to talk with your partner here about, do plants need soil? What are the benefits of the hydroponics? And what might be some limitations that you can think of? Right, so I'll give you about a minute to discuss, and then we'll kind of answer this question as a group again. All right, so here's some good discussion here. What might be some benefits of hydroponics? They mentioned a major one in the video.
You know, just talking about like net zero water, how they reuse it, and then also with farming there's excess water use, so it would prevent that. And then also I was thinking about how like some farmers use pesticides and stuff which are bad for the environment and put stuff in the air and on the plants, so that would prevent that. So overall just better for our environment.
Yeah. So at least water-wise, better for the environment. We're using much less water, even though we're strictly using water to grow plants, right? Thinking about like pesticides or even fertilizers, any runoff from fields into like neighboring wetlands or streams, and that kind of contamination that can occur in farming wouldn't happen so much in hydroponics. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen at all. Who knows, waste management wise, I've never been in a hydroponics facility. I don't know how they manage their waste, but I have a feeling it's much less and maybe disposed of in a more sustainable way. Any other benefits of hydroponics? All right, well, water is definitely a major one. I would say another one, which they really didn't talk about in this video, is that you can basically stack plants and do like some vertical growing with hydroponics, which overall might have a lower amount of space that you actually need. I don't know. A question came up of like, does it produce more food? I don't know. I haven't looked into the stats of that. I can see it going both ways. Yes, it could produce more food using less resources, but maybe it's a little bit harder to get it up to that growing standard. I don't know. But everything about some of the limitations of hydroponics. What might be some of the major limitations here?
With bigger plants like trees and big shrubs and stuff. I feel like unrealistic to try to grow a tree just water. And he said, like, yeah, it's possible to grow a tree in a lab, so it seems like that would be the only, or in a greenhouse. So maybe that's the only way to hydroponically do that. So I feel like that would be a limitation. Like, you can't really do that outside.
Yeah, maybe some of the bigger plant species that grow really huge is just not really practical to do in hydroponics. Yeah, what are some other limitations? Yeah.
Take a lot of money and resources to build the labs.
Yes, it is expensive. All right. If you think about you as an individual, it's easy enough for you to put a potted plant in your dorm room, right? But to have a hydroponic system that's continually monitoring the nutrients and the water flow, that's kind of expensive, harder to do, right? I believe, anybody here work at Big Hill Farm? At one point, I think Big Hill Farm was looking to do a little bit of hydroponics out there in that adjacent greenhouse, kind of by the facilities out there. I don't know if they ever got that up and going, but I know that they have tried it, right? Because it can be very practical. But just the average person, no. Even the average person starting a hydroponics business, it takes a lot of money, right? And energy. Think about the energy costs of running a building and all those lights and electricity. Any other limitations of hydroponics? I think those were the major ones. Yeah, really expensive. It's really cool, but it's really expensive. All right. I have another group question here, which kind of brings you back to cation exchange here. All right. I want you to think about now what type of molecules does the process of cation exchange release? So a bit of a review question here. And then think about what might be some advantages of growing plants hydroponically in space. Right. So I'm going to give you another couple minutes to review these. We'll go over them before moving on to our next topic here. How's it going? I never get to this side of the classroom because it's harder to navigate.
Yeah.
Things are making sense so far. She's over here, we're working away. Alright.
I think I'm pretty. So in space, hydroponics plant growth in space. How would you do that with like?
Enclosed systems, so that water isn't just.
Okay.
It is possible.
Okay. Okay, so I was curious because like when we were reading the endurance book, like I'm talking about air,
A little
and
bit.
then I was like, oh, didn't realize that air is like everywhere. So I was like, just
Yeah, so the water was like, it has like two regions in it. And so they would like form a. I once had a discussion in this class.
yeah, because like as long as it stayed in line.
Yeah, maybe if it's like closed enough. But even within the tank, if it's air, you just
I think so. Yeah.
Alright, so if we think about cation exchange, what molecules need to be released from the soil in order to make them available to plants? Our terminology here. Is it an anion or cation? That need to be released from the soil particles. Yeah, they're cations, right? Anions, they're negatively charged, they're just hanging out in that soil solution. But cations, they need to be released, so the plant has to exchange another cation to get that cation it wants released from the soil particle. All right, hydroponically growing plants in space. What could be some advantages here? Or disadvantage if you talk about any disadvantages.
For advantages, we talked about how like it doesn't matter what location you go to, Moon, Mars, etc. Like you're not using the soil, you're just using the water, so it's like you're not dealing with the challenges from the soil.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about the soil media. You just have to make sure the nutrients and are correct in the water, right? What could be some other advantages?
I would assume it would take up less space because you could, having veg, soil beds and all that, you have to have compost and then soil and then water, and just one way to have all that.
Yeah, it could take up less space, definitely. Did anybody discuss any disadvantages?
Keeping the water in one place.
Keeping the water in one place. Yeah, you'd have to grow them in a very confined unit. All right. Let's see. I'm going to go straight into our next topic here because we haven't even been in class for an hour. This is going faster than I thought it would. We might get up fairly early today. Our next topic in the soils, though, are unique soils, right? So far we've been talking about kind of idyllic soils, right? Soils that have nutrients, have plenty of cation exchange capacities, lots of water, nothing really too toxic in the soils, right? But soils, at least here on Earth and other planets, can pose some challenges for plants because they're not these idyllic soils. And so if we think about unique soil types, I'm talking about maybe desert soils, right? Desert soils tend to be very dry. If we're thinking about the pH of soil, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides here, they tend to be very basic or very alkaline, which can pose some challenges. White sands in New Mexico, right? Plants are growing there, right? So there's plants adapted to growing there, but they have to overcome the challenge of having lots of gypsum in the soil. And gypsum is a substance that can actually lower the amount of nutrients that are available for plants to uptake, right? Chaparral, where I did a lot of my grad school research, right, tends to be, well, you can find them in like the just inland coastal area of California, right? They tend to be very dry and very low in nutrients. So there's just not a lot of nutrients available. So plants have to overcome those challenges as well. All right, so on these unique soil types, we often see plants that are endemic or that are specifically adapted to that very specific spot and are really only found in that very specific spot, right? Because over time, they have adapted to the challenges posed by that soil type, right? These unique soils also tend to be biodiversity hotspots, right? Meaning there's a lot of there's a lot of diversity in organisms, lots of different species in those areas, right? It doesn't look like it. It looks kind of barren, right? But while there's not a lot of one single type of plant or multiple types of plants, there's a few of a lot of different types of organisms in these areas, right? Because they're so specifically adapted to that area, we get a lot of really cool organisms that will evolve. Some challenges that it can pose to plants, right? I kind of mentioned a couple of these. Nutrient uptake, right? There might be no nutrients. It might be hard to access the nutrients and get the nutrients to the plant, right? A lot of times, if there are nutrient issues in the soil, some areas of the country, plants have adapted to be carnivorous, right? So these are pitcher plants here. They get a lot of their nutrients from capturing small organisms inside of their pitcher, digesting their bodies to get the nutrients because they can't get the nutrients from the soil. They aren't there. Water uptake can be very challenging in salty soils or in salty areas. It can be hard to uptake water into the plant, which leads to the salt accumulation, right? If they are growing in these salty soils, A, it's hard to get water, but B, they're also taking up salts, and salts can be very harmful to the plant's just overall functioning, right? Heavy metal accumulation. So if there's a lot of heavy metals in the soils, some plants can accumulate heavy metals, no problem, right? Other plants, if they accumulate heavy metals, it's going to cause some real issues in their biological functioning, right? And calcium accumulation can also occur. We tend to find that in areas like the white sands of Mexico with gypsum. We can accumulate calcium, right? Just like all these other ones like salts and heavy metals, too much of something that a plant needs can actually be a bad thing. If it's too abundant, too present, it can lead to some toxic properties, right? We're going to talk about a few of these unique soil types, right? So I did want to mention acidic and alkaline soils. So we're thinking about the pH of soil, right? If we say a soil is more acidic, right, in the science definition of what is pH, there's going to be more hydrogen ions present, right? So it would be a low pH, it's going to be more acidic. There's going to be more of these hydrogen ions rather than these OH ions here, all right, or these hydroxide ions, right? Opposite is true if the soil is more basic, right? Has more of the hydroxide ions present rather than the hydrogen ions, right? So that's the mechanism behind what's making these soils acidic or basic, right? The amount of hydrogen ions or hydroxide molecules here, right? If we look at the pH scale, right, a pH of 7 is a neutral pH. Right? If we think about the pH of soils, right, and where we find them, right, the acidic soils on this map tend to be in red, right? They're typically found in regions that can be more humid, right, that have lots of precipitation, right, lots of rainfall, so you get a lot of leaching of the soils, right, and have lower decomposition rates, right? We can see there's a lot of areas here that have these more acidic soils, like the Amazon, again, humid, lots of precipitation. In the US here, we see more on the eastern coast, tends to be a little bit more humid, has more precipitation than the west coast, right? On the other hand, if we look at the alkaline soils, or the soils that are more basic, right, they're going to be found in kind of those opposite areas. Dry, arid regions, right, not a lot of rainfall, less leaching, and lower decomposition rates as well, right? So we see in the western part of the U.S. here, and the Sahara Desert, I forget the name of this desert down here in South America. Anybody know the name of that desert? Oh, it's like on the tip of my tongue. What was that?
Atacama.
Yes, thank you, because you should be familiar with that, right? Thank you. So we see the Atacama Desert here. Can also be found in some wetlands, can also be very basic as well. So even in the Minnesota here, while we don't see it really prominent on the map, right, there are some areas, especially in the boggy areas up north, that tend to be a little bit more basic. So acidic soils. What are some of those problems associated with acidic soils, right? Well, it basically will decrease the cation exchange capacity of the soils, which means there's going to be a lower nutrient reserve in the soils, right? Decreases the amount of nutrients available to us, right? And for some nutrients, right, instead of decreasing the amount, it can actually increase them to the point where they're toxic. And so if we look at this pH graph here, right, we have a bunch of different nutrients that can be found in the soil. On the bottom, we have our pH scale, right? 7 is our neutral here, right? If we're looking at more acidic, so the left side of this graph here, we see that a lot of them start to taper out, right? They become less available, right? But on the other hand, things like iron and manganese and boron and copper and zinc, for the most part here, will increase and become kind of to those toxic levels, which plants don't really like. Right? Alkaline soils can pose some of the same challenges here, right? So if we're thinking of, again, our pH scale here, now we're on the right side of our graph, right? Some of them become less available in the soil, like iron and copper and zinc, right? But then there's other molecules, like molybdenum, hopefully I said that right, sulfur and potassium, even phosphorus here. They become very abundant, right? And they can actually volatilize, right, and become unavailable to use biologically, right? So even though there's lots of them, that's not really toxic, it's just in a form that's unavailable for plants to actually utilize. Right? We think about the acidic soils, right, and some adaptations that plants have to go through in order to survive in these soils. Right? We can get those plants that exhibit conifery, like those pitcher plants on the previous slide, but also the sundew plant, right? It's also a coniferous plant. It has like these sticky hairs on the plant. We call them trichomes. An insect or a small organism will come along, get trapped in it, right? Won't be able to fly away, and that plant is going to slowly digest those insects, right? We tend to see plants that are very tolerant to high levels of iron and aluminum because they tend to be more prominent. Those nutrients are more prominent in acidic soils, right? Because there's not a lot of nutrients, right? Plants tend to invest a lot of their resources into growing more roots and increasing the amount of root mass underneath in the soil so that there's more area that the plants can explore through their roots and hopefully get enough nutrients, right? So they have to invest more in finding those nutrients, right? Some plants actually have the ability to actually increase the pH around their root, right? They will exude some chemicals into the soil, which help make the soils less acidic and more amenable for the plant itself. Those are pretty cool adaptations, right? Alkaline soils, right? Alkaline soils tend to be hard, right? And a little bit more harsh for plants to grow in because they can contain these really hard calcareous layers, right? So full of calcium, they're really hard. It's almost like a rock, right? It's really hard for roots to penetrate through this layer, right? So roots can't go very far, right? So that's one of the challenges posed here, right? And so this often leads to a decreased soil depth. Plants can only grow maybe a couple inches below the soil rather than around here in the prairies, roots can get down to taller than myself into the soil, right? So not a lot of room for growth here, right? Again, we tend to have these plants that are also adapted to utilize the specific nutrients available. All right, so alkaline and acidic soils. Let's review. I want you to think, what is the difference between them? And what challenges are similar for the organisms that grow on these types of soils? I'm listening in, yes.
Yes, they are. Okay, okay.
Do you have to use special soil for it?
Are you asking?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was listening to
I
Venus
thought you were asking
flytraps.
a question. I was like,
So Venus flytraps, I don't know about specific soil types, but I know you water it with like deionized water that have like zero nutrients in it. Because if you don't, they won't produce like the actual flytraps because they don't need to.
we should try this. We had a Venus flytrap.
Yeah.
It was a little small one, but it died. But I don't
Okay.
know what kind of soil it was
I
growing in.
think it was kind of finicky to grow, so kudos on you for having it alive at some point. I've never attempted. All right, so difference between these acidic soils and alkaline soils. What are some of the main differences we find?
We tried this for that.
Where they're found.
Where they're found? Yeah. What's in the soil, right? What nutrients are prominent? Which nutrients are not prominent? Which ones are biologically available for plants? Yeah. So what are the challenges for organisms in these soil types? Challenges that are maybe similar between the two. both soils have a challenge that plants grown on either soil type have to figure out how to live with. Think about how they're going to get their nutrients. I see a lot of playing stairs here. All right, so if we think about what's similar between how plants are adapting to each soil types, they have to adapt to nutrient limitations, right? And just getting the right amount of nutrients to sustain life. I mean, that's going to be similar no matter what soil type they're in, right? What's different, though, is that for plants that are maybe living in alkaline soils, right, they also have that added challenge of a very hard layer in the soil that they can't penetrate into versus acidic soils. They can easily grow in those soils, and they're in fact going to grow out even more roots to try to increase the surface area from which to find nutrients in the soil. Any questions? All right, I'm going to go on my last set of slides here. Just some other unique challenges from soils, right? So heavy metals. Heavy metals, they're toxic to us, they're also toxic to plants, right? And heavy metals can accumulate through the food chain. And so if we think about ourselves, right, maybe this image here has like, I want to say this is like an oil spill, right? So we'll say this is an oil spill, there's some toxic chemicals in there. These little insects are being eaten by the bluegill, so the amount of toxicity in this bluegill is increasing because it eats many of these insects. This bass is going to eat many of these bluegills, right, and accumulate the toxins even further. Us, as humans, might eat many bass, right, and have a lot of toxicity at that point accumulated throughout the food chain, all right? So toxic to humans, toxic to other animals. Plants have to learn to overcome this toxicity, right? Some of them can't, right? Some plants you simply just can't grow them in a toxic soil, right? A lot of plants, actually, you can't grow in a toxic soil, right? But some plants can, and some plants are even used in this method called phytoremediation, right? This is where we're actually using plants to remove the heavy metals from the soils, right? So we're using plants that can tolerate heavy metals, right? These plants essentially take up the heavy metals into their leaves, right? And then we can come through and harvest those plants, right, that have all the heavy metals accumulated in their leaves, right, and process them in a safe way, right? So essentially we're using the plants to take up all of our heavy metals for us and kind of remedy this soil. We often see this being used a lot near like mining areas out west. A lot of times they'll use phytoremediation, right? They'll plant plants that are resistant to heavy metals. They'll accumulate heavy metals, then they'll go through and call the plants away and then dispose of them safely, right? And over time, our plants or our soils will become less toxic, right? But we have to think about certain aspects, right? We have to think about what are the physiological tolerance limits of species, which means in the normal functioning of a plant, just like how we are normally functioning as a human, right? How much can these plants actually take, right? How much can they absorb before it becomes toxic? Plants like this Thelspe, right, is actually a plant that's really good at phytoremediation because it's great at taking up the heavy metal of zinc, right? It's very tolerant to zinc. So if we're trying to remove zinc from the soils, this plant is often a go-to, right? If we think about plants, again, are they tolerant to heavy metals? We have to think about how different species might process the toxins, right? Some of them might keep them in their leaves, others might exude them out back into the environment and not keep them in the plant's mass itself, which wouldn't be so good if we're trying to get rid of the toxins from the environment. So a lot to think about when we think about phytoremediation, but it's a really cool process. Okay. The last type of contaminant I want to talk about is perchlorates. Right? Perchlorates are typically going to be found as a salt. Right? It's going to be a chlorine atom surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms. Right? Now, they can be manufactured for use in factories, right? But when they're found naturally, right, plants don't often tolerate them very well. They're very toxic, so for humans to consume perchlorates, they can be very harmful to our thyroid, right? But if we're thinking about astrobotany and growing plants on other planets, these are actually very abundant on Mars. So if we're thinking about growing plants on Mars, we really have to think about this issue of perchlorates. All right, let's see. I am going to show you this video here, though I did also link this video in case you wanted another interesting video on Martian soil. It might be helpful about the lecture. That's basically the last content slide I have. I did want to mention tomorrow, right, we have our endurance discussions, so chapters 1 through 5. If anyone does not have the book, come see me after class. I do have a copy that I can loan out. For the discussion, I'm asking that you submit 3 discussion questions or topics. You'll see that linked on Moodle on the day of our discussion. Right? It doesn't have to be anything too elaborate, just something to get the conversation going. Right? That soil profiles lab report is also due tomorrow, so hopefully you have at least started on some aspect of it. And again, if you have questions, it's not due till midnight tomorrow, so I will be here to answer any questions you might have. And then we do have another short quiz. We will start learning about the basics of plants tomorrow. All right. I was going to give you a break, but the only thing we have left is to choose our final project. So rather than a break, should we just move on to final project and get out really early in class today?
Yeah.
All right. I thought there would be agreement there. All right, so final project selection. I know you all had your brainstorms. And again, I'm going to try to make this as fair as I possibly can make it because there's a lot of overlap in your brainstorms. I'm going to use my wheel of names. So I put all your names up on there, and that'll decide who gets to choose when. Once you have locked in your choice on Moodle, down at the very bottom of Moodle here under the final project heading, there's just a short, it's technically a quiz for you to fill out, just saying what your final project is and who your group members are. That way I can also keep track of who is doing what. That's worth a point, so make sure you submit that before you leave class today. After you have figured out what you're going to do, that's it. You can head out, make sure you check your plans today. But this might take a while because I know some people have to reorganize their thoughts if they're not going to get what they first want to do. So I'm going to spin the wheel to see who goes first. All right, our lucky 3. What would you like to choose? Passengers. All right, I'm going to write it up here so everybody knows what has been taken. All right, so now passengers is now off the list. Oh, maybe? All right. Do we have a choice? Interstellar. All right. Remind me, how are plants used in that one again? I always get them all mixed up.
Like most of the world's food crops are getting being completely wiped out.
That's right.
Bacteria or fungi to go light.
All right. Yes, that's right. I have watched so many of these at this point, they all start to mingle in my mind. All right. So Interstellar has been chosen. All right, Marcy, you get to speak for your group today. Red Planet. Remind me, is that a TV show? A movie. Okay. I don't know that I've seen that one yet. I'll have to watch it. All right, Lily and Marco. The 100. All right. The 100 has been chosen. 3 groups left here. All right. Go away. All right. So 2 groups left here. Uh-oh. Oh, all right. Do we have a decision?
Alright, we're gonna do Red Planet
All right. I actually kind of like that one. It's a fun video game, right? Yeah, yeah. So we'll do Red Planet Farming. I didn't know of that game until last year, and I spent a considerable amount of time playing it. Oh, I don't know why I spun it, but we have Isabel and Raphael. The Angry Red Planet. All right. Now, what form is that in? It is a movie. Ooh, I don't know if I've seen this one either. This is a good list. All right. Now I believe I'll have one student joining us tomorrow. We will have to assign him to a group. So if you're a group of 2 and amendable to a third, please let me know. You're amendable to a third? All right. I will assign him to your group then. All right. Submit that up on Moodle. It's just going to ask for what you chose and who your group members are, and that's it. So enjoy your extra hour today. Yes.